Don't forget this. It's important when life is difficult, when we are facing challenges, in the midst of adversity, to never forget the lessons we learn there. All of us are well versed by this time in how disruptive and disorienting, even discouraging, the season that we find ourselves in can be. But in the midst of our struggles, some of the most important life lessons are driven home to us. And it's very important that we never forget the lessons we learn here. I learned as a young man that the school of hard knocks, the difficulties and the failures and the adversities of life charge a very high tuition. And it is not a tuition that you want to go to waste. When you pay such a high price, learn the lesson, pass the class. Do not fail to pay attention to these things. I think the lesson that I'm learning during this season is a lesson about myself. I think each of us in these seasons are invited to learn a lesson about who we really are, because when all of these things are stripped away, all of our rhythms are disrupted and all of our comforts are set aside, we find out who we really are. We learn these lessons in adversity. We also can learn these lessons by observation. We can audit the class, if you will. We can learn from the mistakes of others. We can learn from the failures of those around us. We can learn from the struggles that others have survived. This is the message of the ancient wisdom of the Hebrew prophet Jonah ben Amittai. His is a life we are not to imitate. Don't be like Jonah, but learn from him. Learn from his failures. Learn from his struggles. Learn from his mistakes. He paid the tuition so that we can learn. Today we come to the final lesson from the life of Jonah, from the struggles of the prophet Jonah, if you will. And that final lesson is simply this. When we are involved in a tug of war with God, the smart money is always on God. It's my prayer today, and it's my prayer every time we are together, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in God's sight, and that God would use his word spoken by his servant and anointed by his Spirit, particularly today, to remind us of the important lessons we are learning in adversity, and to especially remind us that those lessons are about us. It was April the 29th, or April the 21st, 1989, the Universal Pictures released a movie based on a novel, a 1982 novel by an author named W.P. Kinsella. The title of the novel was called Shoeless Joe, and it was a story of the Chicago Black Sox scandal and one of their players, Shoeless Joe Jackson. The star of the movie was a rising Hollywood celebrity named Kevin Costner. He played the lead. His name was Ray Kinsella. But the title character, Shoeless Joe Jackson, was played by an unknown young actor named Ray Liotta. The cast was supplemented by some other fine actors and two established Hollywood stars, James Earl Jones, who stole my voice, and I would like to have it back, and the Hollywood screen legend Burt Lancaster. If you're unfamiliar with the story that this movie tells us, it's a story of a struggling Iowa corn farmer who one late summer afternoon, early evening, was walking through his cornfield when he heard a very discernible voice. The voice repeated itself a number of times by telling him the same thing, by telling him, if you build it, he will come. The Kevin Costner character was confused by this instruction, but upon reflection and through the power of a dream or a vision, he realized that what he was to build was a baseball diamond in the middle of his cornfield. A completely illogical and nonsensical decision, but the movie portrays Ray Kinsella, the Kevin Costner character, plowing under acres of his cornfield to build a beautiful, manicured, well-lit baseball diamond. And then nothing happens. The montage of time-lapse goes from that fall through the winter, through the following spring, into the next summer, and to the time almost a year later, when one evening Kinsella and his family are in the farmhouse and the lights are on this beautifully manicured ball diamond in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa, when suddenly out of the corn a mysterious individual appears. Ray Kinsella goes down and introduces himself to him, and he finds out that this individual dressed in vintage baseball gear is in fact Shoeless Joe Jackson, who had died, by the way, in 1951. He has mysteriously appeared on this ball field, and Ray Kinsella tells him that he built it for him, and he believes that this was why he built the baseball diamond, so that Shoeless Joe Jackson could come, and they shag some fly balls and play some catch, and they have a fine time together. And as Shoeless Joe is leaving, he asks if he can invite some friends. And as the plot develops, players who are long since dead from the history of baseball populate the field, and they play pickup games and baseball games on this field in Iowa. And time goes by, and they settle into a rhythm when suddenly the voice speaks to Ray Kinsella, Kevin Costner again. And it tells him to ease his pain. Through a series of events, it convinces us that the person whose pain Ray Kinsella is supposed to ease is a famous author who lives in Boston. In the book, it is J.D. Salinger, who wrote Catcher in the Rye. But when the film went into production, J.D. Salinger said, "You can't use my likeness or my name or I will sue you." So they created a character named Terrence Mann, played by James Earl Jones. So Kevin Costner gets in his appropriately furnished Volkswagen bus and drives from Iowa to Boston to sneak up on Terrence Mann and take him to a baseball game at Fenway Park. While they are there, they both share a vision of a name of a player named Moonlight Graham, and they both hear the same voice. And it says, "Go the distance." They wind up driving to Moonlight Graham's hometown, and through a series of events, they bring him to the ball field, and the story unfolds about this supernatural experience in a cornfield in Iowa. The film tugs at all of the right heartstrings, and in fact, it was nominated for 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It didn't win any of them, but in 2008, the American Film Institute ranked it as the 6th best film about America ever made. In 2017, the Library of Congress and the American Film Institute archived it and marked it for special preservation because of its aesthetic and cultural contributions. Now, if you haven't figured it out by now, you will know, well, you will not be surprised when I tell you that this movie, called Field of Dreams, is one of my favorite movies. But make no mistake about it, it is not one of my favorite movies because of its theology. Its theology is somewhat wacky, and I don't recommend it for all of its theology, but I do recommend it for all of its feels, because it has all the feels. But its theology is not that far afield. The idea that a mysterious voice would interrupt a person's life, and that voice would lead them on an unconventional adventure, is not that different from the story of the prophet Jonah ben Amittai. The voice of God came to him while he was minding his own business in Judah and told him that he was to go to the arch enemies of the nation of Israel, to the capital of the Assyrian Empire, to the great city of Nineveh. And Jonah was to offer them a chance to repent. He was to offer them God's grace. He was to tell them that the judgment of Yahweh was coming, with the idea that they would repent and that God would relent from judging them. But Jonah wanted nothing to do with it. It wasn't like Kevin Costner hearing the voice and the Ray Kinsella character then obediently builds a ball field. No, Jonah runs away from God. Rather than going 500 miles to the east to Nineveh, he heads 2,000 miles to the west to the Phoenician city of Tarshish. But before he can get there, a storm sets in on the Mediterranean Sea and threatens to destroy the ship that he is on, and the sailors throw him overboard, where he is swallowed up by a great fish. In the 2nd chapter of the book of Jonah, I believe it is a after-death experience for Jonah. It is what you might call a near-death recollection of his thoughts as he was internalized by the great fish. I actually believe that Jonah died in the belly of the fish, but 3 days later, God raised him from the dead, and the fish vomited him back onto the shores, probably very close to where he began, near the village of Joppa. The voice comes to him a second time in Jonah chapter 3 and tells him, now I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim the message that I am giving you. And this time, Jonah obeyed. He travels to Nineveh, and for 3 days, he preaches to the Assyrians, and they receive the message. And they fall on their faces before God, and they plead out to the God of Jonah, to the God of Israel, to Yahweh, and they cover themselves in sackcloth and ashes. And God sees their repentance, and God relents from the judgment that he will bring, and he gives them grace and a second chance. And this makes Jonah furious, because this was very wrong. The grace of God applies to him, not to everyone else. And Jonah didn't want the Ninevites, he didn't want the Assyrians to be given a second chance. He wanted them to be destroyed. And so Jonah prays a prayer that may be familiar to all of us. Jonah argues with God. He says, I told you so. I told you, Lord. I knew this was going to happen. I knew you were going to do this. This is why I decided to go the opposite direction and to go to Tarshish, because I knew you would do something like this, because I know that you are a God of grace, and you are a God who abounds in love, and that you are compassionate, and that if they repented, you would give them a second chance. I knew that you would do that. And I'm so frustrated with you. And then God speaks to Jonah again and says, do you have a right to be angry? Is this really reasonable? You see, for Jonah, he's like us. He believes that the grace of God is sufficient for us. That the grace of God and the second chances are things that we deserve. But the people around us, not necessarily. But more importantly, Jonah forgot. You see, Jonah believed in the sovereignty of God. Jonah obviously believed that God would do what God would do. But what Jonah forgot was that God is inviting us to participate with him in this work of grace. That God has designed the world in such a way that his compassion and his love and his grace is made manifest to us and through us. In fact, the world is designed in such a way that the work of God is done by us. But it's not just done by us, it's done on us and in us. You see, it's about us. Now, the story of Jonah could have ended there. It could have ended with Jonah's argument. But God reiterates, God gives us a second chance to get the point. The story of Jonah tells us that Jonah, after his argument with God, went out east of this city and he built a little shelter and he decided, I'm going to camp here until the city of Nineveh is destroyed. I'll just wait. I don't care how long it takes. I'll sit here in my little shelter and I'll wait for the wrath of God to descend. And the next day, a plant grows up next to his shelter, and it's a large leafy plant, and it miraculously grows overnight, and it provides lovely shade for Jonah in his shelter, and he loves the plant. He was very happy about the plant. But the very next day, the same God who grew the plant sends a worm, and in one day, the worm consumes the plant and destroys it, and it withers and dies. And as it does, the sun beats down on poor Jonah's head, and Jonah is miserable as he's sitting there waiting for the city to be destroyed. And he's so miserable that he says, I wish I were dead. It would be better for me to be dead than live through this adversity. And then God says a second time to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? Is it right for you to be angry about that plant? Because you had nothing to do with that plant. You didn't plant its seed. You didn't cultivate it. You didn't tend it. You didn't even know it was going to be there. It grew up on its own and it died on its own. It grew up in one night and died in one night. And yet you care more about this plant than you do about the people of the great city of Nineveh. Why should I, God, who can raise up a plant, not care about a great city of 120,000 people? People who have never had the opportunity to even know right from wrong, to know their right hand from their left as well as any animal. Why should I not care about people like you? You see, Jonah's theology was half right. Jonah's theology was half right because he believed in the grace of God for himself. He didn't understand that he was an agent of that grace for others, that God had designed the universe to invite us to participate with him in the work of restoration, in the work of redemption, that God has entrusted us with the greatest mission that any human being can ever have, to be agents of hope, to be the hands of God, to be the feet of God. God has designed the universe to work through us. To the message of redemption and the message of restoration comes through us. And you see, the mystery of the entire story of the book of Jonah is the mystery of the story of Field of Dreams. Field of Dreams is in fact one of my favorite movies. I'm not going to deny it. And it's not because of the theology or because I'm some kind of mystic. It's not even because Field of Dreams is the best baseball movie I've ever seen. The best baseball movie I've ever seen, obviously, is The Sandlot. Doesn't everybody know that? If it's not The Sandlot, it's got to be A League of Their Own. I mean, that's got to be in the top two. Or maybe it's Pride of the Yankees or 8 Men Out or Bull Durham. It's not because it's the greatest baseball movie ever made. It's because it's a movie about us. It's a movie that reminds us of how important we are. We are necessary to God. See, the amazing thing about the story of Jonah and the interesting thing that I think is what we can never forget about the story of Jonah is that it's a story about us. It is God inviting us to be agents of grace, just as he was inviting Jonah. You see, at the end of the movie of Field of Dreams, there's a scene. There's a scene where all of the players have left for the day, and just Shoeless Joe Jackson is standing in the outfield, and Kevin Costner and his wife and daughter are standing on the baseline. And Shoeless Joe Jackson, Ray Liotta, turns and he looks at the Costners, at the Kinsella family, and Costner says to Ray Liotta, he says, "What are you staring at, you ghost?" And Ray Liotta looks toward home plate, and there at home plate is a singular ball player. Kevin Costner's character immediately recognizes that player as his father. And before they play catch together and before they get reacquainted and the mystery of that reunion is played out, he realizes that this was about him. That when it said, "If you build it, he will come," it was talking about him. And he realizes that easing his pain is easing his father's pain. And that he had to go the distance to bring him here. And at the end of the movie, Kevin Costner looks at the Ray Liotta character and he says, "It was him." But then if you remember it, the Ray Liotta character looks at Kevin Costner and says, "No, it was you. It was always about you." You see, the final lesson of the story of Jonah, the lesson that I don't think Jonah ever learned. That's why the story ends with Jonah complaining, sitting above the city of Nineveh. But it's an invitation for us to realize, to learn from Jonah's mistake, that it's about us. The final lesson of the story of Jonah is that in our tug of war with God, in our wrestling, in our discomfort, in times of adversity, the smart money is always on God. God will see us through. God will get it. God is in control. But there's a footnote. And the footnote is simply this: God's money is on you. God's money is on us. When everything is said and done, the smart money in our tug of war with God is on God, but God's money is on me. It's up to us. Don't forget.